Ahoy there! Captain Benzie here, coming at you with another episode of the Frigate Pilot's Manifesto, the series that aims to teach you everything you'll need to know about the different frigates of Eve Echoes. In today's video we're going to be revisiting one of the Tech 7 assault frigates, this time around the Minmatar Breacher Assault. Now, when these launched, I think some people were a little bit underwhelmed by the assault frigates, and I think some people now look at them and give them a bit of a hard time, simply because they don't quite stand up to the Tech 8 interceptor frigates, which is a problem in and of itself, and we will be discussing that later on in this video. That said, I do think that the hard time they get is relatively undeserved. There are improvements that could be made for sure, and as I said, we will talk about that later, but I do think they still have a place, and you can have a lot of fun flying these. So in today's video, we're going to have a look at the Minmatar Breacher Assault, how this works, how you can fit it, how you can fly it, and sort of what kind of things you can expect to be able to achieve with it, because as I said, it's a pretty fun ship. Now, if you do enjoy this video, let me know by hitting like on it, sub to the channel for all things Eve Echoes, ding that notification bell to never miss an upload, and let me know in the comment section down below what ships and topics you'd like to see me cover in future content. I'm not ignoring those of you who are asking for cruisers and other ships like the Moa 2 Guardian, for example. I will get round to those soon enough. Just, people mock me for being on the test server all the time, so I do like to try and do some live server content from time to time too. Now, if you do want to go the extra mile to help support this channel, we do have a Patreon page where you can come and pledge to donate and help support the channel, and we have a Redbubble merchandise store if you've ever fancied representing the Catskull Academy or the Catskull Cartel on something like a t-shirt or a hoodie. There's all kinds of really cool stuff there to check out. Now, I talk a lot about commenting in the comment section. Do please let me know your thoughts and opinions on this particular ship. I think the assault frigates are a very divisive subject. I think there's a lot to talk about here, and I would love to hear your thoughts and opinions on it down below. But please, 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 please be civil to each other. Open conversation and discourse is important. I think having your opinion heard is an important facet of a community-driven game like this, but personal attacks and being rude and swearing and overly aggressive, I will not tolerate in my comment section. At best, you stand to risk having the comment removed, and at worst, I will hide all future comments from you from the channel, so don't be that guy. Do be nice and polite to each other in the comments. Anyway, all of that said and done then, let's jump right in to talking about the Breacher Assault. The assault frigates are all found at Tech Level 7 of the frigate branch of their respective empires, so for the Breacher Assault, of course, we need to go up the Minmatar Republic tech tree, and there it is there. Now, the Breacher hull itself was once described by Federation Navy Lieutenant Colonel Am Lynch as a goddamned radar scaffold with a reactor strapped to its ass, which is certainly a fitting description, I feel. Now, this resulted in a fantastic response from Van Rijdeba, the lead technical engineer at Boundless Creation at the time, basically the kind of lead designer of the Breacher. Now, he said, "Lynch is right, and I hold nothing against her for speaking her mind when it comes to how Matari hardware looks. We're not like the boys over in the Federation. Pure function. Form is a secondary concern." The Oman Navy laughed at the Breacher when they first saw leaked designs come out of Hagalur. They sure as hell shut their mouths and wiped the smiles from their faces when they were putting out the flames on their NCO's backs. The Breacher is one of those ships that has ultimately had a lot of very effective service in the Republic fleet. It's cheap, it uses technology in a very minimalistic and intuitive way, and basically it embodies the Minmatar design principle of doing a lot with a little. Now, the Breacher hull has since been modified twice. Firstly, it was given torpedo handling technology from the Typhoon battleship in order to make it the Hound, and more recently it was modified by the Thucker tribe. Now, the Thucker tribe are nomads who roam the Great Wildlands in caravans of spaceships, and they value heavy firepower over other considerations. As such, they upgraded its missile hardpoints and guidance systems, and then gave it significant improvements to its propulsion array, including dampening systems and stabilizers to mask the signature bloom caused by micro-warp drives. They also took that opportunity to add impressive shield power shunts to its Scarab B-Series deflection shield emitter to improve its defensive capabilities even further, thus resulting in what we refer to as the Breacher Assault. And it's got a couple of cool looking skins here. Obviously you've got the standard Thucker tribe sort of white mottled effect to it. We did get a Yule Envoy one, which gave it a shiny metallic red and green colour scheme for Christmas, and of course there is the Smoke smoke grey variant, which is what I'm using currently, just to give it some real sort of dash of colour, and I quite like how the torpedoes look when you fit with this one. Anyway, let's have a look then at the attributes and fittings here of the Breacher Assault. We're looking at a ship with a typical assault frigate profile, which also is the same profile as you'll find on any of the faction frigates, of 3 high slots, 3 mid slots, 3 low slots, 3 combat rigs, and 3 engineering rigs. It gives you a nice amount of variety across the board, which gives you, the option to fit a few more bits and pieces here and there. Ultimately, I find that 3 is a good balance for slots. Anything less than 3 feels very constrictive, and certainly as you go down the frigate lines, you're getting a lot of 2s in slots. So it's nice, once you hit the Breacher Assault, that everything is a 3 here. Now, as I mentioned, obviously the Thucker tribe did work a lot on the defensive systems here, and that shows you've got a defense basically of 3,054. Most of that is in the shields, but there is a good amount of armor there. Just being a typical Minmatar ship, it is the structure tank that is weakest. We've got a good power grid, 58 megawatts is more than we could ever really need on the Breacher Assault. Good capacitor bank as well of 527 gigajoules. It's not huge, but it's good enough for what we require. The signature radius is very low for an assault frigate here at 27.3, and it gets a decent flight velocity of 395 meters per second. This, as far as the assault frigates go, is the smallest and the fastest of the bunch, and certainly that really shows later on in the combat demonstration. It also has an absolutely massive scan resolution, 880 meters. That's a very quick lock-on time, even against other small ships. The problem with the Breacher Assault is that mass. What you're looking at there is 1.36 million kilograms with an inertia modifier of 2.75 times. This is astonishingly cumbersome for a frigate. It really does struggle to come to a new heading and to speed up and, decrease speed accordingly, and it can struggle to hold a good orbit without heavy rigging. Honestly, this to me is one of the biggest problems with the Breacher Assault, but we'll talk more about that later on. As we look at the trait description, of course, being an assault frigate, we get the roll bonus of a 5-second increase to the damage control activation time. So if you're putting a damage control unit here on the Breacher Assault, rather than it being a 13-second activation time, it lasts for 18 seconds. Now, damage control units aren't quite as popular as I personally think they should be, but here on the Breacher Assault, that additional 5 seconds does make all the difference if you're using one. It can be, quite simply put, the difference between life and death, winning a PvP fight and losing it completely. Ultimately, if you like using damage control units, then the Breacher Assault is an excellent ship for that, simply because of those additional 5 seconds. Doesn't sound like much, but trust me, it's a lot. The other skills, of course, are Advanced Micro Warp Drive Operation. This gives a 10% reduction to the warp drive signature radius penalty, and a 5% reduction to the capacitor required to keep your micro warp drive active. These are both related to the micro warp drive, not your ability to jump to a target. This is micro warp drive capacitor requirement and micro warp drive signature radius penalty. That means that rather than the micro warp drive increasing your signature radius by, say, 500%, it will only increase it by 250%. I say only, that's still a massive increase, and to me forms kind of the second problem with the assault frigates here, and that's that the micro warp drive signature radius penalty reduction is just not quite as high as it should be. In my opinion, this needs to be at least 75 or 80%. I would actually argue that this needs to go right up there with things like the power grid requirements for large weaponry on things like the Tornado, and drop right the way down to a 95% reduction. I would almost consider just giving that as a roll bonus, but otherwise, if you work out the math on that, give them, what, 22% per level? Or, no, that's too much, my math's terrible there. Give them 19% per level. Give them 19% per level micro warp drive signature radius penalty, and that gives you a 96% reduction overall, which, in my opinion, would really help fix a lot of the problems with the assault frigates in general. But again, that's a topic for another video that I am actually working on. The second skill we're looking at here is Advanced Frigate Command, and that gives you a reduction to the activation time of small missiles and torpedoes, and gives an increase to the amount that your shield booster boosts your shields by. This means that the Breacher Assault is actually surprisingly tanky. It can take a good amount of damage and respond to that quite comfortably. Very useful in PvE. In PvP though, you've only got 3 low slots. You're going to be wanting at least 1 propulsion system in there, probably a micro warp drive, and then if you want to use the damage control unit that the roll bonus applies for, you then basically have the shield booster and that's it, which means your resistance is going to suffer without an adaptive invulnerability field. You're not going to have anything like a weapon upgrade module, like a ballistic control system, that kind of thing there, which is, again, kind of a problem with the Breacher. It's got a lot that it wants to do, but unfortunately they're all vying for the same low slots. Basically, you want to have a micro warp drive, a damage control unit, and a shield booster, and that's your 3 low slots taken up. I said earlier, it's nice to have 3 low slots, but when your ship then gets bonuses for 3, well, it's the same problem with the Crew War and its E-War slots. You kind of have all these bonuses that you want to use, but you really have to pick and choose which ones you actually want to use, which kind of gives you a disappointing feeling with the hull. Overall, though, don't get me wrong, the Breacher Assault has an excellent signature radius, a good flight velocity, and it is surprisingly useful in PvE. It's just in modern PvP that it really struggles. I did some tests with Bishop in Catskull Void, and he ran at me with both a Condor Interceptor and with an Atron Interceptor, and I just couldn't even hit them with the Breacher Assault. Using torpedoes, because there's no range bonus to the torpedoes, I just couldn't hit. I couldn't get in range to use a scram or a web because of that inertia and that mass. I just couldn't orbit fast enough. I couldn't change my heading fast enough to keep a bead on the Interceptor. Now, I get it, Interceptors are supposed to be fast, but it means that the Breacher Assault here just cannot go toe-to-toe with a single Interceptor. That Interceptor will win almost every single time, hands down, unless they've gone for a very short close-range build where they're using something like, snub-nosed railguns or autocannons. If they're using any of the longer-ranged ones and trying to keep outside of scram range, you're screwed trying to use a Breacher Assault. For PvP though, these are excellent for taking out destroyers. They out-DPS most of the destroyers out there, and are fast enough that they can close the gap, get in, hit and run if necessary. The issue, as I said, simply put, a Breacher Assault in a one-on-one with an Interceptor just doesn't do it. Against cheaper cruisers, anything that's not a Stabber Fleet issue, basically, the anti-Interceptor Stabber Fleet issue, or destroyers, you'll probably do really well with a Breacher Assault. Just be wary of those Interceptors. Let's have a look then at actually fitting the Breacher Assault. Now, this particular fit that I'm using here is what I would refer to as a Republic Fleet fit or a Meta Level 6 fit. Everything here is at least it's maximum Meta Level 6. You won't find any of the Meta Level 8 storyline gear, there's no Dead Space gear here, which means this is ridiculously cheap to fit, and you'll see that it can do some very powerful stuff with that later on. Rigs as well, I've stuck to Tier 2 rigs, which is probably more expensive than you might want to spend, but I just wanted to showcase it with the Tier 2s that I had lying around, rather than going out and buying a load of Tech 1s and having to ship them back from Jita or wherever or find someone in the thing to build them. I just had some Tech 2s lying around. So this is still a pretty cheap fit. I think all in all this is probably it's still less than 100 million ISK, which I know is not necessarily cheap to some of you, but most of that is on those Tech 2 rigs, with a lot of those being 7-8 million a piece, and obviously there's 6 of those. If you can go right the way down to the standard versions, you can probably do this entire ship for less than 50 million. Anyway, let's actually talk about the fit, shall we, rather than just what level I'm using. So I'm using torpedoes, small torpedo launchers. Here, of course, as I said, Republic Fleet small torpedo launchers. The downside to these big time, and it is a consideration we need to take into account when flying a Breacher, is that missile range. It's only 6.7 kilometers, which means if you cannot maintain a good 6 to 5 kilometer orbit, you are not going to be able to apply this damage properly, at which point you may as well switch to missiles and go slightly longer range. Here, however, I'm aiming for a PvE fit that will also do well against slower moving PvP targets, or at least ships that are slower than the Breacher Assault. Look out for the stats later on that. As long as I can maintain that 6 kilometer orbit, I'm going to do good damage here. Each of these small torpedo launchers has 81.46 DPS, 50 damage across the board, electromagnetic, thermal, kinetic, and explosive. Very, very powerful, and it fires at a ridiculously fast activation time of 2.47 seconds, thanks to the Breacher's hull bonuses. Beyond this as well, if we then go down to the low slots, talking about the breacher hull bonuses, I've gone for a Republic Fleet medium shield booster. You will need some engineering skills to train into this, or possibly use some of the ancillary power grid rigs if you're not quite trained up as high as I am in frigate engineering, if you want to fit this, or you may have to just use a lower meta level version of the medium shield booster. You can go with a small shield booster, but I figure if you've got the power grid to fit a medium, you may as well, especially since it's getting a 37.5% increase to the shield booster mount, thanks to the Breacher Assault's ship bonuses. So 391 shield boost per cycle. Now, this cycle's about once every 5 seconds. Of course, it chews my capacitor like you wouldn't believe. Obviously, 129 gigajoules is an awful lot. But the way I look at it here, 129 gigajoules for 391 shield is a massively good trade-off. Ultimately, you are swapping, a decent chunk of your capacitor for a massive amount of shields. This, of course, is not a stable build, simply because we've got a micro warp drive and we have that shield booster, but most of the time, those aren't going to be active. The only module that should be active pretty much the entire time you're fighting is the Caldari Navy Adaptive Invulnerability Field. Sadly, there's no Republic Fleet variant of this, so I did have to go shopping in the Caldari Navy in order to grab this one. But again, you're looking at some good shield damage resistances there, 33% pretty much across the board, additional resistances, which means your shield takes less damage. 27.37 gigajoules per activation cost every 11.5 seconds shouldn't be too heavy a cost on your capacitor either, and you should be able to keep that running pretty much indefinitely. Obviously, that allows you to absorb any damage coming your way, and then you can just boost up when you do take enough for the shield booster activation to be worth it. For a propulsion module here, of course I've gone for a small micro warp drive, Republic Fleet in this case. Flight velocity adjustment here of 533% is absolutely massive. This means that we can get some absolutely killer speeds out of this with that micro warp drive active, but of course it does add a lot of extra weight. 500,000 kilograms there of extra weight to the ship, which, thanks to the Breacher Assault's absolutely abysmal inertia modifier, really does impact our ability to maneuver. That's where the problem with interceptors comes. Yes, you can go fast enough that if you were to make a beeline at them, you should theoretically be able to catch them, scram them, web them. Chances are, though, they're going to hit orbit on you, at which point they have an angular velocity and you just can't turn to keep up. So it's like trying to chase someone in a super fast moving truck when they're on roller skates and can kind of just dance around the sides of you. It's a big problem here with the Breacher Assault, and ultimately is one of the stats I really wish they would fix, especially since the Breacher is supposed to be an incredibly maneuverable ship in the background. But hey, apparently sometimes NetEase just kind of get on, all excited about building a ship and don't necessarily consider what the stats actually all mean. But hey, I do genuinely love you guys. I know you're working hard on this game. I'm looking forward to the balance patch, and I'm just kind of noticing that there is a balance patch on the way, so I'm kind of getting my opinions out now, and hopefully people will take notice, start commenting, we explode it up, and then hopefully NetEase will change these things in the patch. Anyway, back to the Breacher Assault itself. Signature radius adjustment here, you'll notice, is only 227% increase, thanks to the bonuses from the Breacher Assault. Again, that is still way too big for my liking. This still makes you bigger, as big as a battle cruiser when it's active. It's kind of like one of those things of, like, who cares? Like, wow. Okay, not quite a battle cruiser. You're as big as a cruiser when you have this active, which means you're still not going to be tanking with the micro warp drive, speed tanking with the micro warp drive active anytime soon. And of course, it still has that capacity multiplier reduction. 25% of the top of your capacitor gets chewed just for having the micro warp drive fitted. That's something I wouldn't mind seeing accounted for on these assault frigates either, but maybe I'm asking too much there. For the mid-slots, however, a Republic Fleet Warp Scrambler and a Republic Fleet Stasis Webifier give us some nice tackle modules. Obviously, the Scrambler switches off micro warp drives, the Webifier then locks a ship down, it reduces 59% flight velocity there, so if they're moving at 1,000 meters per second, they're now only moving at 410 meters per second. It's a big slowdown there, especially if you've deactivated any micro warp drive they may have as well, so they probably don't have a micro warp drive and an afterburner, so the micro warp drive turning off takes them down to standard flight velocity, velocity, then the web of fire drops that by almost 60%, which brings them to a screeching halt right next to you, as long as you can catch them and get within the range. Obviously only a 13.6 kilometer range there. You do need to be within that 13 kilometers in order to actually apply those to your target, but heck, if you manage to hit that 13 kilometers, activate this and slow them right the hell down, chances are you've probably got them grabbed in that position. Finally then, an up here small energy Nosferatu fills out our mid slots. Now the reason I haven't gone for a meta level 6 version here, I did have one lying around, is because as you guys know, I will refuse to fit an Imperial Navy small energy Nosferatu to a Minmatar ship. I would rather take the knockdown to a meta level 5 energy Nosferatu than go with a Mar energy Nosferatu on a Minmatar ship. The alternative was I could put a Vrykolakus on here instead, but that's a meta level 8, which would have broken my rule of not being higher than meta level 6. Anyway, this does help us maintain actually kind of capacitor stability. It means if we turn the micro warp drive and the shield booster off, we are completely capacitor stable, which is pretty cool with that Nosferatu running. And it does mean that if we've got the shield booster chewing our capacitor for a couple of cycles, you can use the Nosferatu to bring that back up. Now, in terms of the rigs, starting with the combat rigs, I've gone for 2 bay loading accelerators, which make your torpedoes fire even faster, and a warhead califaction catalyst, which increases the damage of those torpedoes as well. With those in there, we're looking at a 244.38 DPS frigate at tech level 7, which is not bad. I know I'm a bit spoiled with a Dromiel that does 490 DPS, yes, seriously. But this isn't a bad DPS for a frigate. I think I'm spoiled an awful lot when I think about how I've got that Dromiel set up, but hey, we've got a good offensive here, and we are missing the damage control unit. I don't know if you spotted that. Anyway, so for the engineering rigs, however, I've gone for auxiliary thrusters, which give us that little bit of extra speed, polycarbon engine housing, which drops the inertia modifier by quite an amount, and that is absolutely necessary. If you're going to fit any of these rigs on here, make sure it's the polycarbon engine housing. Without it, you're just not going to be able to hold an orbit at a decent speed. It's the breacher assault is that bad when it comes to that inertia modifier. The third one is kind of up to you. You can go, I've gone for a targeting system subcontroller here in order to push my targeting, my scan resolution here over 1000. It's now sitting at 1265mm scan resolution, which is insanely fast lock-on time. But if you're not worried about that because PvP is not really a big thing for you, I would swap that for a second polycarbon engine housing instead and go for that extra reduction to the inertia modifier. Now, speaking of its stats here, like the inertia modifier and its velocity, if we have a look at the navigation tab here, you'll see that cold, without any of my propulsion modules running, we are looking at 632 meters per second, which is pretty good. That's enough to speed tank without a prop mod active, and that's a key point that you'll see shown later in the combat demonstration. Warp preparation time is a little bit larger than I'd like, 3.12, but again, that really does showcase how cumbersome this ship is. Netties, please drop that inertia modifier. The breacher assault needs a lower inertia modifier. All the assault frigates need lower inertia modifiers. It's insane that they've got worse inertia than blasted destroyers and cruisers. They are cumbersome, slow-ass ships, and they need fixing. Please fix, please fix, please fix. Anyway, pretty awesome stats there, I personally feel. Let's undock this and showcase it in action. This is Shameful Quaif Robbery Hard, which is a Tech 9 Galente encounter, and I'm soloing this here in the Tech 7 Breacher Assault, using the same meta level 6 gear we saw. Now, that Dominic's unfortunately did take a long time to go down. I actually had to, my screen ended up locking itself. It took that long to go down. What I do, though, when the next wave spawns is I lock onto the small targets, I hit orbit on one of them, I activate the micro warp drive, usually for a single activation, just to close the gap and get nice and close to my targets. Here you can see I'm going for one of the Quaif Robber Nemesis 2s. There is also a what's it called there, a Celestis 2 Covert Ops. We've got a Talos 2 and a Catalyst 2 Interdictor as well there. Those are going to be my priority targets, the Nemesis 2 and the Catalyst 2 Interdictor. You'll see that I actually turn the micro warp drive off and I just orbit with without a propulsion mod going. I'm not using an afterburner here. I'm quite happy sitting just using the basic propulsion from the ship itself, about 631 meters per second at maximum. And you'll see that I take very little damage at all from these. I'm actually speed tanking without a prop mod thanks to how small this ship actually is. Once my shield drops to about 70%, a single activation of that medium shield booster is more than enough to boost me all the way back up to 100%. With the scram, the web, the adaptive invulnerability field, and the Nosferatu working, I'm actually sitting pretty much capacitor stable, and capacitor stable very high up the percentage as well. Ultimately, you see, I'm not, the capacitor barely goes down. In fact, it's recharging when I'm not using the shield booster. I put the shield booster on again just to get myself back up to 100%, and I'm now here orbiting 5 kilometers around that Catalyst 2 interdictor. Now, you may be asking, why on earth do I bother with propulsion then? Well, ultimately, I don't want to use an afterburner, because one, it's going to be chewing my capacitor to have it on at all times, and you can see, you don't need it. You actually don't need an afterburner to speed tank most enemy ships and these kind of things. That Catalyst 2 interdictor is not really hitting me, neither are either of those cruisers, the cruiser, the battle cruiser, or the battleship. I'm too small, and my basic maneuverability is fast enough to not worry about it. And in fact, if I put an afterburner on, I find that with the inertia modifier, I'm not able to hold a 5 kilometer, 6 kilometer orbit. I actually end up going sort of 7, 8 kilometers all the way out, and not able to get a good orbit out of it. I can't stay in range with my torpedoes. If I put the micro warp drive on, it's even worse. So I use the micro warp drive to quickly get me into range of my next target. I then switch it off, and I go into just a manual slow orbit, although slow in inverted commas, as you can see, it's 630 meters per second in orbit around a target, without a propulsion mod, and you see, I'm taking no damage at all from these now. I'm small enough and fast enough, basically, that I take almost no damage. There's a couple of percentage of small minor hits here, but the capacitor's right the way up at 85% nearly. I'm sitting above 90% on the shields. When that does drop to 70%, well, as I said, I can just activate a single cycle of that medium shield booster, and away we go laughing. Now, this entire Tech 9 encounter takes about an hour and a half to do, but that's 4.5 million in an hour and a half, nice and easily, without much risk at all. And if I drop down to just doing the Tech 8 ones, those take about 45 minutes, and they're about 1 million ISK there, so you do get a decent amount of ISK out of this, considering how cheap the ship is in comparison, and how risk-free you are essentially flying this. If someone drops in, it's nice and easy for me to quickly warp out, and in fact, in a lot of cases, I can actually challenge someone who jumps into an anomaly if I'm doing it, and go for PvP. I did take this for a quick flight around Tama. Unfortunately, I found nothing but faction cruisers, and I'm not throwing away a breach or assault against a faction cruiser that it just stands literally no chance against. Unfortunately, I do think solo PvP is still something that's a little bit of a difficulty getting around, because again, interceptors are not a great target here either with the Breacher Assault. I did try and catch a couple of them in Innsmother, but just couldn't. They all ran like the cowards they are. Cowards, they're not cowards, they're smart people. They know that if that interceptor gets caught, it's going to be in a world of trouble against something like a Breacher Assault. The trick is to not get caught. Anyway, folks, that really covers everything here I wanted to say about the Breacher Assault. Excellent ship here for PvE, surprisingly cheap, does do surprisingly high tier content as well, can be useful for PvP as long as you're not expecting it to go up against any of the particularly big or nasty targets. Anyway, let me know your thoughts and opinions about the Assault Frigates and the Breacher Assault in specific in the comment section down below. Otherwise, folks, thank you for watching right the way to the end, happy sailing, and see you in New Eden!